I'd like to share some thoughts about the draft and some upcoming military situations, for lack of a better word. So, in the news today is June 15th, 2024, it was announced that the House approved some language in the current Defense Authorization Act, which is the budget for the military that they pass each year, and they like to sneak significant policy shifts into that bill because to vote against it is political suicide because you'll be ostracized as against the troops. So, in that bill that the version that the House has approved, is language that makes registration in the selective service system automatic for those males between 18 and 26, I believe. Now, legally, you're supposed to register a selective service and it's connected to things like student loans, but I suppose they don't chase you down if you don't do it. I don't know. I'm not up on that. I haven't looked at it in a long time. I joined the Army when I was 18, so it really didn't matter either way. So what's disturbing about this is that people are saying that this is a reflection of the difficulty the military is having to meet its recruitment goals. You can look that up, but they're many percentages behind where they're supposed to be. And one of the problems is that the demographics that traditionally enlist into the military aren't doing it anymore, since those demographics tend to not be caught up in the woke business, and the military is very much. Discharging people for refusing the COVID shot was a big deal to many potential recruits, as is the constant need to sit through yet another presentation telling you that white males are the enemy. So, they're under strength right now, significantly. They're really struggling to recruit people. And at the same time, we have all these undercurrents of war brewing around the world, particularly in Ukraine. And that's a nice dovetail to what I'd like to talk about next on a related note. It's easy to dismiss things like this as conspiracy theories because, after all, how could you know what they're up to unless they said it? And so it's just anyone's best guess, right? Well, in this case, wrong, because it turns out that the military is a very large organization. They happen to have a lot of people in think tank type situations, roles, and at least some of what these people are producing is actually published to the public. And so, for example, you can look on the Army War College website and read publications on the ideas of certain people who are influencing these decisions. So I happened, in a weird chain of circumstances, to come across one such document. And it's pretty interesting. One, it's really well written, and that's just refreshing to read. But that's sort of a lateral point I don't want to get off on. But there's a brief section called Casualties, Replacements, and Reconstitutions, and I'd like to read that to you. So it says, the Russia-Ukraine war is exposing significant vulnerabilities in the Army's strategic personnel, depth, and ability to withstand and replace casualties. Army theater medical planners may anticipate a sustained rate of roughly 3,600 casualties per day, ranging from those killed in action to those wounded in action or suffering disease or other non-battle injuries. And I'll continue reading in a second, but I just want to comment, if you are aware, the wars in which the United States has engaged over the last 2 decades, the casualty rate has been massively lower than that. But I'll continue. With a 25% predicted replacement rate, the personnel system will require 800 new personnel each day. For context, the United States sustained about 50,000 casualties in 2 decades of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And most civilians, when they hear the word casualty, they think dead. That casualty includes wounded. It's just any person that's pulled off the battlefield for any reason. But there it is. There's the statistics. 2 decades in 2 wars cost 50,000 casualties. That's wounded and dead. And so what the people who are in charge of planning for these events are saying is that were the United States to enter into a conflict that's like the Ukraine-Russia conflict, then 3,600 casualties per day are what we should expect. And it would take 800 new personnel each day to replace those losses. And you might be wondering how that math works out, because 800 is a lot smaller than 3,600. Most casualties are minor, so they get back into the field after they get treated. So, or whatever that magic math is, it doesn't matter. The point is the number's really high. And here I'm going to continue reading, but if you know anything about the Boer War, I always feel sensitive saying that word because I'm not South African and my wife is, and I cannot say it the way she does. But the Boer War, it actually was an extremely significant. Wars are always advancements of technology, and sometimes the even if the war isn't global, it's a very interesting demonstration of the current state of the art, so to speak. So, for example, I think it was in the Civil War that the first automatic weapons were the machine guns were used, and they were primitive compared to the ones today, but they were terrible to deal with. And then that was significantly advanced by the time World War I rolled around, which had its own first-time use of different weapons. This is the first time airplanes were used in combat, at least at a wide scale, but it may have been the first time at all. And throwing grenades out of planes was a new thing, right? And everyone was locked into trenches. Before that, global conflicts, large-scale conflicts, still had people lining up and shooting at each other face to face in huge units. That the Civil War was like that. So the United States Civil War. So the Boer War was interesting because it was the first large scale guerrilla war. It was a guerrilla war. It was fought civilians against civilians. The military folks were intertwined. There weren't really front lines. It was just sort of everywhere all at once. And it was a foreshadowing of things to come. And that's what each of these major wars has been through time. My point here is, people talk about World War III. Whether the conflict is global or not actually doesn't matter. But the point is, the next conflict the United States will be involved in significantly, it is not going to look like the previous ones. The likelihood is very low. And so what will it look like? Well, probably the Ukraine-Russian war. And if you know anything about that, it is really different than prior wars. They've got drones dropping grenades on people, drones blowing up tanks, very inexpensive drones blowing up tanks. I'm not talking about Reapers, the US super expensive type unmanned aerial aircraft. I'm saying like a cheap $500, $100 drone with a hand grenade strapped to it, and then they fly it over the thing and drop it. So there's a massive disruption of military technology right now. And it's just yet another delusional bubble about to be popped. So years ago, when I said Russia and China are a threat, they're going to invade the United States eventually, we will be at war with them, many, many people thought I was absolutely nuts. And now a whole lot of people are saying that. So that bubble has been mostly popped. There are still a lot of people that cannot even imagine another country invading the United States. And they think, oh, that's impossible. That can never happen. It can happen. It's going to happen. And there are plenty of reasons right now that you could go down to justify that statement. They're more than sufficient to justify that position. But another bubble that's absolutely going to be popped is the common expectation of what a conflict would look like in the modern world. And when it comes, it's not going to fit that expectation. It's going to be very different. And there are already people who understand this, and they're the ones making the plans. So I'll continue now. I'm going to reread the last sentence. With a 25% predicted replacement rate, the personnel system will, that was 2 sentences ago, will require 800 new personnel each day, For context, the United States sustained about 50,000 casualties in 2 decades of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. In large-scale combat operations, the United States could experience that same number of casualties in 2 weeks. I'm going to say that again. In 2 decades in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States suffered the number of casualties that people are expecting in 2 weeks in a modern conflict. So that's different, isn't it? So where are all these people going to come from? Well, let me continue reading the last paragraph. In addition to the discipled disobedience required, well, that was in a different section of the essay. The U.S. Army is facing a dire combination of a recruiting shortfall and a shrinking individual ready reserve. Those are the people that are still on contract, but they're not getting paid and they're not showing up. When you sign a military contract, it's 8 years, and you might only do 4 years of active duty, and then you're still on the hook. They can recall you at any time without instituting a draft for the next 4 years. That's called the IRR, the Individual Ready Reserve. This recruiting shortfall, nearly 50% in the combat arms career management field, meaning the people that shoot the pew-pews, they're 50% fewer than what they should be, is a longitudinal problem. It's a big problem over a long term. Every infantry and armor soldier we do not recruit today is a strategic mobilization asset we will not have in 2031. The Individual Ready Reserve, which stood at 700,000 in 1973 and 450,000 in 1994, now stands at 76,000. These numbers cannot fill the existing gaps in the active force, let alone any casualty replacement or expansion during a large-scale combat operation. The implication is that the 1970s concept of an all-volunteer force, that's when they stopped the draft, has outlived its shelf life and does not align with the current operating environment. In other words, we don't have enough people volunteering. We have to bring back the draft. The technological revolution described below suggests this force has reached obsolescence. Large-scale combat operations troop requirements may well require a reconceptualization of the 1970s and 1980s volunteer force and a move towards partial conscription, which is the draft. So, this again, and go to the top so I tell you correctly, this is from the U.S. Army War College Quarterly Parameters, Volume 53, Autumn 2023. So this came out actually a year ago next month. A call to action, lessons from Ukraine for the future force. So when we're thinking about long-term consequences, we tend to think about how things are right now and imagine that they'll be either the same as they are right now or even better. That's actually written into Isaiah. It's human nature. It's always been that way. And we're almost always incorrect. Now, some people take that a step further. They look into the past and they create a model of their expectations of the future and they back test it to the past. That's great, but things change. If you created a model for how to be financially successful today and you were using how things are today and back testing it to how things have been for the last 20 years, you're probably going to be broke because it's changed that much. There are so many things, and I'm talking in terms of general principles right now. I'm zooming out of the whole military, your kids are going to get drafted thing. But we'll come back to that. There's so many things in this world where the average person's expectation of the future is so far off that they are guaranteed to fail in horrific, terrible ways. And part of that is because their perception of the present is so abysmally incorrect and incomplete. So I'm telling you right now that there are a multitude of things that you ought to be planning on that you're not. One of them is that we live in a very unstable world. We could talk about the collapse of the dollar, which is ongoing. It's not a future event, it's already happening and has been for a long time. We could talk about changes in military. We could talk about changes in culture. We could talk about all these things. But the fact is that things are not the way they used to be. They're changing with greater rapidity and greater consequence than they have in anyone's living memory, which means anyone who's alive today. It's more radical than that, than anything they've seen. So let's think about this. So what happens is there's already a normalcy bias where people want things to stay the same and they really assume that that's the way it's going to be or better. So they're resistant to evidence that contradicts that. And so they don't plan for the future. You see this, people live check to check. They don't think, oh, something could happen in the future where this amount of money isn't enough anymore. And they do that with their ideas. Have you ever thought about transferring the idea of living check to check to your beliefs? That everyone does this. They think that their current beliefs, the sufficiency of their current belief, implies sufficiency in the face of future revelation, we'll say, using that word broadly, future events. As reality unfolds, you assume that your current beliefs will be sufficient. And when you see counter evidence, you just ignore it because it's uncomfortable. People find comfort in staying the same instead of improving and becoming better. If you detach from what is right now in terms of optimizing for what could be in the future, you don't take this personal ego hit every time that there's contrary evidence. So zooming back in now to the military thing, what's going to happen to you and your family if they start doing partial conscription? So if they bring back the draft, what's going to happen? If you have children between 18 and 26, or you're 18 to 26, you really need to think about this, because when something happens, it's way more difficult to do the right thing than if you think about it ahead of time and make up your mind before it, while it's still a rational exercise, before it's an emotional reaction. So, for example, when you were told that COVID vaccines would be mandatory in certain situations before they were, did you walk through that exercise rationally and say, this is what I'm going to do if this isn't something I want to do? Or did you just ignore it until it locked in and you said, well, you threw up your arms and said, well, I've got to get a paycheck to support my family, so I have to take this shot even if I don't want to? Because a whole bunch of people did that. Well, here's another situation. You might be saying, I don't even want to think about the fact that me or my kids, depending on your age, or my grandkids could be drafted. Well, guess what? It's time to start thinking about that. And it's time to figure out what you're going to do if that happens. Because we have an increasing number of situations with extreme consequences coming down the pipe. And if you don't think about them ahead of time and decide what you're going to do, you're probably not going to make the right decision. Especially as more and more of these things require awareness beyond your own and wisdom beyond your own, because you're going to have to find and commune with people that are wiser than you. And that's super uncomfortable for Americans to hear, because we believe in this myth that we're all the same and that any person has an entitlement to what every person has. And that's just not true, right? If you work harder, you have a right to more than someone who doesn't work as hard. If you're smarter than someone else, you have a right to better ideas than they will have. In fact, if you don't have either of those two things, you're doing something wrong, right? In that case. So, for due diligence, for completion's sake, I have to mention the fact that part of what they're pushing for with all of this is to include women in registration for selective service. I'm not going to waste time sharing my own position on whether that's a good or bad thing. The point is, it is a thing. And if they manage to tie this to the Defense Authorization Act, it's probably going to pass. And they've been trying to do this for a while. Eventually, they're going to succeed. You can't, there's only so far you can push contradictory things, mutually exclusive things. There's only so far you can push them before one of them has to go, right? And you can't beat the drum of men and women are the same, men and women are the same for very long until you also have to draft women, right? That's equality. And they're not going to back down on everything they've gotten from beating that drum. And so it's very logical to expect that women will be drafted if men are drafted. So you're not out of the woods if you say, well, I'm a woman, or, well, I only have daughters that are between 18 and 26, or younger than that, because obviously they're going to age into that range. Another thing that you have to worry about is if your prior service. So if you look at Ukraine, the people they're putting on the battlefield right now are old. They're not 18 to 26 because all those guys are dead. That's the blunt fact, okay? They're getting their butts kicked. All those guys are maimed or dead, and so they're fielding guys that are 40, 50 years old. If your prior service, first off, if you're in the IRR, you really need to think about this, right? Because your butt's going to get recalled, most likely, right? But if you're older than that, you're not out of the woods, because they'll send you before they'll send a 13-year-old. And don't think that that's outside of the realm of possibilities. Now, as a person willing to do extreme things, I am personally not worried about this for me or my family. But I also have the hedge of the fact that I was medically discharged. So I'm 40. So a couple of dams have to break before they try to get me. But I also happen to live right next door to one of the largest wilderness in the United States, if not the largest. So I'm not telling you what my plans would be, but I am telling you that I feel sorry for the guy who's in charge of trying to find me, because he's going to have a really hard time. So, yeah, it's something to think about, and it's a big deal. And it's a wonderful microcosm of much larger issues in play right now that most people just have no clue about. And it's very sad, because this is coming full speed and you really need to deal with it.